Hey, hey. Did you cut your hair? Yeah, it looks, oh, there it is.
She's in a ponytail today.
Yeah. Hey, Amazon device.
Hello.
We got a good day to go out. I'm glad. Did you guys get everything installed on your phone? Good. Hey, Graylin.
Hello.
How's it going?
Good.
How did the woodpecker surveying go, Graylin? I think you're the only one so far in that lab. Did it go okay?
Yeah, we found a lot. The app isn't working for me, so I gotta figure that out. But
Oh, no.
like whenever I try to post something, it just keeps cycling, like it's just syncing. And
Oh, maybe you needed to be near internet. Have you tried it? Have you tried it since you've been
I was
home?
on internet. Yeah.
And it's
Yeah, I
still not
have.
working?
Yeah.
Huh.
I don't know what's going
That's
on.
weird. Keep trying. It may be that you have to enter the data on the website, perhaps. You have an
Yeah, I'll
iPhone?
try. Yeah, I do. I'll try the website.
Okay. Because I have an iPhone as well. And do you have an older one or a new one?
I have an iPhone 11, so it's
Oh,
pretty
okay.
new.
So yeah, you have one even fancier than I do. Yeah, weird. Maybe there's an update for the app or something that needs to happen. Keep trying though. So I have to say, did you guys get all the alerts that you are able to go get a vaccine or sign up for a vaccine now? I'm so excited for you. Get in line. Get in line. I want you to be able to hug your family again, visit your family. Pass it along, let your friends know, right? I'm bummed that I didn't have kids 2 to 6 years earlier so that they could be in this round as well. I think the cutoff is like 12 and up for the efficacy on the trials for the little kids. So Connor's only 10. That's not gonna, we'll have to wait a little longer on them. All right. Well, I'm gonna share screen with you guys. We have a lot to cover and I wanna make sure I can get you so that you can do your homework for the community, the first round of the community homework, which is just a brief little math assignment for practice. So I'm gonna share screen. And again, I'm gonna be meeting my lab at 1 o'clock in front of Clinton Dining Hall. So make sure you guys come prepared with some muddy boots and long pants and maybe even a little raincoat in case we get a few showers towards the end of our visit. We were almost through our community interactions. We had covered parasitism, had the one slide of commensalism, and now we're on to mutualism. So again, I wanted to refresh. Remember when we were talking about parasitism, it was a plus minus like predation, right? And we mentioned that the parasites tend to be smaller than the hosts. The hosts are their habitat and they don't seek to kill their host immediately because that would be counterintuitive for them. We talked about how we can describe a parasite, right? They're either endo or ecto, so inside or outside, or micro or macro, so smaller or larger. So we gave some examples of those, and then we walked through kind of some that were in the news. We talked a little bit about COVID, the COVID virus, a little bit about the measles, talked about some ectoparasites with the ticks, and then their endoparasites being the Borrelia Lyme. We talked about the idea that your habitat, your surroundings can influence disease. So, the more smaller chunks of forest, the more edge around that forest, is better habitat for the hosts that carry the Lyme disease and other tick-borne diseases. So having larger swaths of forest, if you think about if you're a contractor, or you're kind of putting forth a development plan for your town, you might suggest making a cul-de-sac, right? If you're building a new development, you have one entrance into it, and then you have your cul-de-sac, the little turnaround at the very end. And then you have just tiny driveways that would come off of that. That would be way better in terms of keeping your forest from being fragmented than having really long driveways, all the way through, right? So that would reduce your risk of Lyme, is, having smart development like that. We also talked about terms that are associated with parasites of plants, right? Holo and hemi, keep that in mind. These are plants. So holo is complete and hemi is partial, right? Examples of that, be able to think of some examples: dodder, broom rape. These are all examples of holo or complete parasites. They have no photosynthetic pigment. They're unable to photosynthesize without their host. And the mistletoe would be a really good example of one that is a hemiparasite. And so because parasites are plus negative, we know they're probably regulators, right? We know that they can alter birth and death of their host. And we know that it probably makes sense for the host to have some strategy to counteract the parasitism. One of them is behavioral, so kind of a proactive way to reduce parasite load. And oftentimes it's grooming, so they can kind of clean themselves off, maybe even eat those parasites. Or they could shift their habitat. If they shift to another area where the parasite risk is lower, then they're in good shape in terms of reducing their risk. If they do happen to get hit by a parasite and attacked, and their load is heavy, there's some strategies as well. Often it's an immune response, right? If you're an animal. If you're a plant, it's a gall. They form a gall. So I promised you guys that I would show you this. So I live like in a pine barren, kind of over by the marshes, and this is an oak gall. So this is a branch. I pick this stuff up on my walk with the dog in the morning. This is a branch, and I'm going to try and find the hole. I don't know if you can see. Where is the insect hole? It's right where the dark, I'm sorry. This is so terrible. This is like me doing a selfie with my kids. I can't get the phone in the right spot. So anyway, see how it's a little darker in there? There is an exit hole right there. So there is a parasitic fly or a parasitic wasp, a female, who's going to lay her larvae on this twig, and they can do it on leaves too. And then the plant is going to grow and try and encapsulate it around it. So this is plant tissue. It's hard. It's like the twig itself. To try and cavitize, right? To not have that insect kind of go any farther. The larvae will develop in here, probably overwinter in here. We talked about them having some of those cryoproteins, and then will emerge from that exit hole after they have fed on some of that plant tissue. If a plant is too parasitized, right? If there's too many galls and this is what that's called, a gall. If there's too many of them, it can impact their ability to reproduce or to even grow, right? So if there's a heavy load of galls, so many parasitoids that have laid their eggs, then you can imagine there could be an altered birth and death, right? So there's potential for regulation. We see that in many of the plants. And I mentioned the goldenrods. Those are the ones that you probably readily would see around your yard, or if you took a hike, you'd probably see in the middle of their stem, you'd see a gall, but that is induced by the plant. The plant is growing around it. And so that's a really good example of regulation. The other example I gave you guys was with the parasite, that little, parasite that got into these ants and forced them to kind of behave differently. The color of their abdomen changes. Birds will eat it. The birds will then kind of go and disperse the eggs and larvae elsewhere. And that's how the parasite will spread, right? And it obviously is not helping the ant at all, right? But clearly they have regulated, and there's a link there to see it. We gave some other examples of altering births and deaths, right? We talked about the lizards. The females don't do as well. They don't have as much fat retained. There's issues with our birds. and the birds and their secondary sex characteristics, and also, their health as well. So those free radicals are absorbed typically when they have healthier food in their diet. So the more orange and whatnot means the more carotenoids, those accessory pigments that are orange, like when you guys eat a lot of carrots, they're picking up those accessory pigments, which help in absorbing the free radicals. And so the females, may not have the same sort of mating attraction because the coloration of the plumage is a little less due to the lack of the carotenoids. Mortality, we gave the example, fish kind of schooling differently when they have too many parasites, parasites in them, they'll behave differently. Birds will attack them, or predatory fish will attack them. So that increases mortality. We talked about, rabbits with too much parasites are going to act kind of slow, and then they're going to get attacked by predators more often. And then I mentioned this a few times, but I wanted to put a slide together for you guys. I'm going to kind of make it bigger now so you can see. Whoops. I'm in the wrong slideshow here. Okay, can you guys all see that? Remember, I promised you, and I've been talking about these sea slugs like you wouldn't believe, right? This is just totally fascinating. In the news, brand new in the news, right? So it's two species of these saccoglossan sea slugs. And interestingly, they eat caulerpa, which is an invasive plant that we might have talked about before. Or maybe I talked about in my other class, but it's like an algae that got dumped into the Mediterranean Sea from it. Not an algae, it's like an aquatic plant that people use in their aquariums. And then it got dumped down, in the sink in the Mediterranean and entered in, and now it's like all over the place. Nothing can kill it. When things bite it, it breaks apart and it has its like own glue. And so it's this crazy invasive species that's climbing all over everything in the bottom of the sea floor. It's even in California now. Nothing likes to eat it because it's got a lot of allele chemicals, except these guys will eat it. So that was kind of an interesting aside as I read more about them. You can learn a little bit about them here. So researchers happened to find out that there was an injury, I think, to one of these sea slugs. They ended up losing their head. And over time, they found that the body regenerated, and they were fascinated. So they did an experiment with about 16 of them, where they, the head was severed, and all of them regenerated. They found that the older slugs weren't able to do this. So there's probably it's highly energetic. And over time, they realized that it never happened in any sea slug. The regeneration never happened, and the dropping of the body never happened in any of these sea slugs that did not have parasites. So this is probably the biggest example of a coevolutionary strategy to reduce dying from your parasite, right? If you can drop your body, knowing that if you kept that body, there were so many parasites that you would eventually die. Now you have evolved a strategy to drop your body when the parasite load gets too big. And because you have a new strategy, the algae that you ate, remember we've used the term kleptoplasty, right? Plastids meaning like chloroplast. So they eat algae, and they can take those chloroplasts and photosynthesize for a period of time, make sugars, right? When they're really stressed or in a stressful environment. I can't imagine a greater stress than this. So the heads can persist during this really stressful time by switching over to using those plastids, photosynthesizing for a period of time to help them in developing this body. And you can see there was a time lapse. I think this was like 14 days, the body regenerated. And in fact, in one case, one animal did it twice, which is incredible, I think. But it was interesting to note that the older ones weren't able to do it. And those that don't have any parasites, there was no need to do this, right? It's energetically costly to do it. But holy moly, like talk about a strategy right there, right? Again, we talked about, parasites and how, disease and parasitic infection can kind of shift through a population. We talked about we all start off sort of as susceptibles, then some become infected. So they switch from susceptible to infected, then some recover. right? And so you can see this SIR model of how parasitic infection kind of moves through a population. And we talked about if the population's never been exposed to this parasite, it could be that much worse. And again, we're seeing that with COVID, right? We don't have the defenses to deal with that. That's why we need this vaccination. And the social distancing practices. You'll notice here, this is what would happen if we didn't have these social distancing measures and the masking. And this is what happens when we take those protective measures. So reducing that transmission. We also mentioned that socioeconomics can play a role as well, right? We tend to have more levels of disease, more levels of parasitism in areas that are socioeconomically a little bit more depressed. All right, so moving on to the commensals, remember we talked about the commensals not being a plus minus, but being more like a plus zero. So the minus is somehow evolved into a zero where you're not harmed, right? One is winning and gaining and having a positive interaction in this symbiosis, that tight interaction with its partner. The other one isn't really feeling any effects. And we gave some examples, right? The burrs, you know, the seed pods that you pull in on your legs or your dog carries in with you on a hike, right? You're dispersing a seed, but it's not really harming you. Although I would beg to differ. Some of them are pretty spiky and always get stuck in my sock and it hurts. But you know, long term, not a huge negative effect. The other example, the fiddler crab, right? That fiddler crab is using a shell of an animal that's already dead, so it's not impacting them at all, and they're gaining a house, right? We mentioned the epiphytes, right? The Spanish moss that's growing on the tree. It's got a place to live. It's spread out. It's able to absorb nutrients and moisture from the atmosphere, and it doesn't seem to impact the tree that it's resting on as well. So that's important to note. And also the shells growing on the shellfish. All right, so that's commensal, that's plus minus. Now remember, we also talked about amensalism in the past. Amensalism was the minus, I'm sorry, the situation with the allelopathy, right? So that one plant is growing and you've got organisms that can't grow around it. So the one plant is growing and sort of adjusting its chemical balance, right? Think about the black walnut, okay? Allelopathy is often listed as a -0, okay? And a -0 meaning that the zero would be the organism that's sort of not the one that's kind of shifting its carbon nitrogen balance so that nothing competes around it. It does have to, you know, adjust its growth or reproduction a little bit, but it's also gaining reduction from competitors. The negative would be the experience that nothing can grow around it. So a -0 example would be allelopathy, where there's a little bit of, you know, volatile chemistry coming out of the roots or coming out of the leaves, and that plant is having to kind of shift its growth or reproduction a little bit, but it's also reducing competition at the same time. We don't, again, that was the one that was a little bit controversial. We don't see a lot of examples of people being able to really test that in nature. So it's oftentimes kind of a questionable thing. But moving forward, we're going to look at mutualisms. No doubt about it. A mutualism is a plus plus. It is a good thing, right? Everybody is winning in a mutualism. However, the mutualistic relationship can change over time depending on the environmental conditions. And we know that that can happen with competition and predation as well, right? So it's a symbiosis, tight relationship, two organisms living, you know, in a prolonged period of time together, and it's positive. So it's a plus plus mutualistic benefits, right? Mutualism. So examples, the leaf and the leaf cutter ant here and the acacia tree. In these cases, we tend to see a boost in reproduction and growth when they're surviving together, when they're living together. And it seems to be sort of a reciprocal exploitation, right? You would want, this strategy would kind of have to evolve. And so they kind of have worked some deal out, right? That they both kind of are doing okay in a sense. It is interesting because remember the niche concept that we talked about, the fundamental and the realized niche? If you have a mutualistic partner, you can increase your niche, right? You can go to places, you can persist in areas that you wouldn't normally be able to do without a partner helping you, okay? So here's the example. Here's the carrying capacity of an organism right here, N over time, growing N over time, without a mutualistic partner. Now add the helper in, and you can increase your carrying capacity, right? You can increase that realized niche. You can survive and persist better when you have that helper. Now, one thing to note is that, like I said, these situations where you have a mutualistic partner can change over time, right? What we tend to note is that as your environment gets more stressful, okay, so think about like drought conditions or low nutrient conditions, we would expect the levels of mutualism, that's this dashed line here, to increase. So as environmental stress in the environment occurs, we would expect you'd have more partners to help you get through. So maybe we would see more mutualistic relationships in the tundra and maybe in the Arctic and maybe in the desert, right? In these harsher environments where you might need a helper. And the other thing to note is that like it can be context dependent. So like I said, it can change over time. This is a link here. If I click on it, hopefully we're going to stay on the same screen. To an example with yeast. Okay, so they've done some experiments with yeast, and they noticed, that, things can change, right? In lab experiments, these researchers looked at normally mutualistic strains of yeast so that when grown together, they both do better. They supplied the yeast, a lot of nutrients. They observed population change. They did this when they were grown alone and when they were grown together. And they found that both strains did better together than when they did alone. So the mutualism seemed to be a good thing. However, the opposite was true in conditions where the nutrients were plentiful. So remember, stressful environments, you should see more mutualistic relationships. If you don't need a partner because you have the resources you need, then why deal with a partner? The partner might actually be a burden to you. And that's what they were finding. So interestingly, the amount of nutrients as it increased between the strains, it was originally mutualistic. It went through multiple phases, devolving into competition and even extinction of one of the partners. With a small amount of extra added nutrients, the strains established an obligate mutualism, meaning they needed to live together. They were obligated to live together. In order to survive. When they added even more nutrients, it turned into a facultative mutualism, meaning sometimes it's helpful for you to be around, but you don't always have to be around because there's more nutrients now, so I don't need you as much. That's facultative mutualism. With even more nutrients, the relationship gave way to parasitism. Okay, so if there's everything that you need in your environment, why would you ever want to spend any time with another organism like that might actually be harming you in some way down the line, right? So anytime you have a stressful environment, you might predict you'll probably see these mutualistic partnerships happening more often. But if that is better the next year and you aren't kind of experiencing nutrient stress, then maybe there'll be fewer of those partnerships because they can turn into something negative. And that's the example I have here with the yeast. Okay, going back here. So here's another example. Over here on the left, when soil phosphorus is low, right, it will help a plant to have a fungus, a mutualistic fungus. They call them mycorrhiza. They will grab that fungus, it will attach to the root hairs, and it will help them, basically help them absorb more phosphorus than just their normal root hairs. So when there's not a lot of phosphorus available, let's grab a helper. Let's grab this fungus. Let's have it, work with me. And I'm going to be able to photosynthesize as the plant. I'm going to be able to photosynthesize and give the fungus sugar. And then the fungus is going to give me the phosphorus, right? And it's a give and take. It's a good thing. However, what happens if there's enough phosphorus there? Then it doesn't make sense for that plant to go into this mutualistic relationship, okay? Over here, when there's herbivores, when there's a lot of herbivorous insects or goats or something that's out there trying to kind of bite and remove tissue or remove seeds and fruits, right? Then, if there's a lot of those insects that want to eat, think of like leafcutter ants, then let's have an aggressive type of species on there that will help fight them off, right? The plant probably has to give that insect that's fighting them a reward like nectar, okay? And in turn, it's going to keep its leaves because those insects that are aggressive are fighting off the ones that want to eat the leaves, okay? But if there's not a lot of those insects that want to eat the leaves around, well then, you know, why would the plant want to give extra energy to make nectar, right? To give them a reward, to have those other ones around. So again, in areas where there's a lot of those herbivorous insects that could harm a plant, yes, I'll give up some of my growth, I'll give up some of my seed production so that I can have an organism around helping to fight off another type that might eat me, right? Because I want to survive. But that can change. That can change over time. Here's another example. You've probably heard of cleaner wrasse, right? Have you heard of the fish that like to eat the parasites off the skin of the other fish, right? So this happens a lot of times in tropical reef situations. They call themselves, well, there's a group, they call them the cleaner wrasse. They're the ones that actually can undergo that sex changing that I mentioned to you guys back when we were talking about life history strategies. So a lot of tropical fish will have ectoparasites on their skin, right, on their scales. And the wrasse is going to be like, oh, cool, awesome, that's food for me. I'm going to go over, I'm going to chomp all those parasites off. I'm going to win because that gives me nutrients. They're going to win because they have less parasite load, right? It's a win-win. What we notice though, is that there can be kind of too much, right? So what if there's not a lot of those parasites, right? So if the parasites are kind of the number of ectoparasites per damselfish, if it increases to a certain point, okay, you'll notice that those fish get pretty voracious. Those wrasse will go after them, go to town on them, and will actually start pulling scales and mucus away from, you know, damaging the actual fish they're trying to kind of help clean, right? So if there's too much parasite load and these wrasse get a bit more aggressive, you can see that relationship shift and become a bit more harmful for those plants. The mucus is often protecting on those fish, but if they take too much, it becomes a problem. So the, you know, moderate numbers of those parasites, those cleaner wrasse don't go crazy, and the other fish will retain their mucus and protection. But if there's too much of a load, we'll see that those fish can become damaged, right? It's a context dependent thing. The other thing to note is that the wrasse is a keystone species. When there are these cleaner wrasse, in a community, a tropical reef community, you'll notice that the number of fish species and the abundance of fish species is higher than when they're not there. So in a sense, they probably are helping maintain the survival of the fish that might normally have been over-parasitized and gone to local extinction, right? So just like we talked about with having that starfish in the Rocky Intertidal, the starfish, which is a keystone predator, eats most of the competitively dominant mussels, the blue mussels, keeps them down at a low level, allowing for the rest of the community to survive, which normally might not have been able to because those are dominant mussels. In this case, the wrasse are allowing for other species to persist when we know they probably wouldn't have given parasite load, and that increases the diversity of reef fish in that community. So they are kind of a good thing in the community. So types of mutualisms, how do we define the partnerships? We mentioned this in the yeast article that I covered. There's often obligated, you must, right? It's an obligate thing. So the two mutualists, those partners, have to be together in order to survive. There's a lot of good examples of that. And then facultative, like you don't have to be together. You can, it helps us to be partners from time to time, but it's not necessary for both of us to survive. So if anybody's ever been out to the desert, and there's a lot of these in New Mexico, Arizona area. So the Chihuahuan Desert would be the desert where I would recommend you go to see these things. There are lots of species of yucca plant. They kind of look like aloe, but they're more spiky at the bottom. And then they have that really tall shoot, right, with these beautiful white flowers, which usually don't attract many kind of day pollinators. They actually attract moths at night. Right? They're very, very fragrant. So they don't have to put their energy at being colorful because they're going to be open and pollinated at night. But they do put their energy towards making amazing scent. If you've ever been near one of them at night when they're in flower, it's just a magic. They need to have a Yankee candle, yucca, yucca plant. So the picture on the left is the moth. This is the Tegaticula moth. There's a bazillion species of Tegaticula moth. There is one unique for each yucca plant. If you lose the moth, you lose the plant, and vice versa. They are an obligate mutualism, okay? They have co-evolved a strategy to help each other. The moth will pollinate the flowers and allow for sexual, reproduction, the plant transferring the pollen to other ones, right? And the wasp, the female wasp, moth, is going to lay her larvae in the flower as the flower is developing into a seed pod, okay? Now I have a picture, another show and tell here, of the seed pod of one of these. Let me find a good spot here. And can you guys see the hole on that one? So that's where the female wasp, I just keep saying wasp, it's a female moth, puts her larvae, puts her ovipositor in there. It's not like soft tissue then. Over time, it hardens into this like hard seed pod. The moth larvae go into the flower and will develop in that as the fruit is being grown. It will develop in there, will eat some of the tissue, right? It'll eat some of those the parts of the fruit as it's developing. But if the female lays too many larvae, the plant says, hey, I know you're up to tricks, and it'll drop its fruit. So over time, they've developed this relationship. The plant will allow enough parasitism, right? Pretty much, that's kind of what it ends up being, right? In a sense, the female lays her larvae. The plant will not have as much fruit as it would ideally want, but in turn, it's going to increase sexual reproduction, right? It's going to allow that female to go flower to flower and increase genetic variation in the long term. And the trade-off is that the larvae of the pollinator will have some food to eat as it develops. So notice this graph right here, the number of yucca moth eggs versus the number of the flowers retained. Remember I told you, when that yucca moth, if one of the mums is not smart and is like, I'm gonna outwit this plant, I'm gonna have 75,000 eggs. And what happens is the plant will just drop its seed knowing, hey, this is not useful to me, I'm gonna just waste energy. And so there's this kind of understanding that, 0 to 6 moth eggs, that's kind of a key kind of set point. Anything more than that, the flowers will drop, right? Tend to drop a little bit more, and that wouldn't be beneficial to the larvae as well. So we kind of have to strike that balance with that lower yield here. And they've sort of maintained that, right? So when there's, 62%, 0 to 6, if the moth lays 0 to 6 eggs in the flower, 62% of the flowers will develop to maturity. That's a win for the pollinator. That's also a win for the plant, right? If that moth is going to lay 9 to 12 eggs, take a little more advantage of the plant, only 17% of those flowers are going to develop to maturity. So they're going to, more of them will drop a little earlier, and the larvae will have less chance of surviving. So there's that sweet spot where they're both pretty happy. Okay, so that's an example of an obligate mutualism, this example of the yucca and the yucca moth. There's one moth for each of the yucca plants, and there's a co-evolved strategy so that there's a win-win for both participants. Another example is with the fig and the fig wasp. I don't know if you guys have heard this story, right? The fig wasp the female will pollinate, and the way that the fruit develops is the ovules are on the inside. It's kind of internal fertilization. So again, you can see here the female who goes and she pollinates. There's, she's going to move on to different flowers. She's going to pass it on, increase, the genetic variation. And so the trade-off is that female is going to oviposit, right? She's going to move in here. She's going to lay her eggs at the bottom of the fig. She's going to drill herself in. She's going to go into this syconium, right, where there's male and female flowers. She's going to lay her eggs, right, in this area. The plant's going to grow a gall to kind of encase the larvae, right, give it some nutrition. And then it's going to mature, right? The wasp is going to emerge after it's developed, and they're going to run around in here and kind of pollinate as they go. and then the males will mature, they will emerge, and their job is, because they're wingless, is to drill a hole so that the females that do have the wings can exit, and they are retained inside the fig. So does anybody, I don't know, does anybody eat figs? Here's a little video so we can watch a little bit about what's happening.
Like fig Newtons.
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna enjoy one myself right now.
The male wasp's next job is to cut flowers.
It's a bit crunchy, as if maybe there's some exoskeleton still in this fig Newton. I wanted to follow up on that, and there was something on this website, which is Taste of Home, if any of you guys read those like cooking magazines and stuff. So if you go to, you know, the high-end grocery stores or a grocery store and you're buying these wild figs, or you go to another country that has figs and you are eating figs, there is a chance that you will encounter one of the wasps in, you know, the wasps in, but what's to note is that there's an enzyme in the figs that helps in digesting some of those exoskeletons. Okay, so it's an interesting relationship, but again, another obligate example, another obligate mutualism example. Normally I pass them out in class. It's pretty hard to do that right now, so I'm just going to enjoy it. All right. Another obligate mutualism is this interesting orchid. You guys might have seen some videos of it with this sphinx moth that has a huge proboscis, right? It's able to pollinate, and you can't have that flower persisting without having that pollinator, and the pollinators gaining nectar reward as well. So that's another example of an obligate mutualism. Another one, the termites and their protists, and you can find in the guts of the termites protozoa, as well as other bacteria that help them in digesting lignin, wood, right? The termites are known to eat wood structure, like our carpenter ants around here, and so they have these mutualists in their gut that will help in dealing with the wood, and there's a give and take of amino acids back and forth between those protists and the termite. It's kind of a win-win for both of them. So that is also considered an obligate mutualism. Facultative mutualists. So these you don't need to live together to be able to experience, okay? So like I said, that mycorrhizal fungi, when you don't have a lot of nutrients or you don't have a lot of water, you might pick up a helper fungus. That's what a mycorrhiza is. It increases the rhizosphere, which is basically the area that could uptake the water, right? Or the nutrients. And so if you have those nutrients, you have that water, there's no sense in having them. They can persist kind of on their own, and can become harmful if you have them along when you don't need them. There's different types of mutualisms. We've talked about a couple, right? The cleaning wrasse, there's a cleaning mutualism. So that's an example with the wrasse, but also the oxpeckers. You've seen the birds that are on some of the cattle and other wildlife that will eat the ectoparasites off of them. That's a cleaning mutualism. A defensive mutualism, this is one we alluded to already, but there's also one where grass that is usually grazed by certain cattle will have a fungus in it, and that fungus will reduce the grazing pressure on that by the cattle. It's got a taste to it that's not as appealing. The ants in acacia. So again, if you don't have herbivores around you, if you don't have an organism that wants to eat your tissue, then why would you provide a nectar reward to have these organisms kind of live with you? In the case of the acacia, those are plants that have spines, right? And so acacia stems that have, ants when you look at the number of herbivorous insects around them, if they have ants, the ants are aggressive and they fight off those herbivorous insects that would normally eat their plant tissue, their leaves, right? Reduce their photosynthesis or seed capacity. Without ants, you'll find that you tend to have a lot of those insects around that will eat them. So the aggressive ants are actually helping them to retain their leaf tissue or their plant matter. The amount of survival of these acacia, with the ants, their survival is greater than without the ants. So there's a benefit to it. And then the pollination mutualism, we've already seen some examples of that. The yucca moth, fig wasp, right? We've seen those pollination mutualisms. There's other examples. Ants will often go after seeds that have some fatty tissue associated with it, lipids. Things like bloodroot and trillium, these are some of the native plants that you'll find kind of popping up in the springtime before the leaves. Right around this time, pretty soon, you'll start seeing like a whole beautiful understory of flowering plants that are only going to show up for probably 2 or 3 weeks before the leaves pop, right? And then kind of outcompete them for sunlight. But the seeds of these plants have this kind of rich lipid reward. They're called eliosomes, and the ants will go after them, and then they will transport them to an area that's away from where their parent plant is. So again, just a reward for the insect that's helping to disperse the seed, gives them nutrients, and it helps the plant in that they can be moved to a new location that will give them an opportunity to not compete with their parent. Again, we talked about the cleaning, right? The shark and the pilot fish, right? It provides these cleaner fish are going to be cleaning the outside of ectoparasites, but at a certain point, we might see that it can become harmful, right? If they take a little bit too much. So again, that context dependency that we saw with parasitism and other situations can shift depending on the environment. Another example, nitrogen fixation in legumes. So this is also really kind of a classic mutualism. You can have plants that need nitrogen, and the nitrogen available to them, atmospheric nitrogen, N2 gas, is nothing that they can convert. They can't use it. So they hook up, kind of like with the ectomycorrhiza, they hook up with the soil microbes, and they pick them up and they form these root nodules. They house the bacteria. The bacteria can convert that nitrogen gas, N2, into ammonia or nitrate or nitrite, which is what the plant needs. That's the useful form of nitrogen for the plant. They can't do it on their own. So what does the bacteria get? The rhizobia bacteria get the nutrients from the plant, the carbon-based molecule, and the plant gets the nitrogen that can be converted by those bacteria, those rhizobia bacteria. Another example is with lichen, right? So you tend to have a fungal partner and an algae or cyanobacteria. Again, a photosynthetic partner that's going to provide the carbon nourishment to the fungus. The fungus, what is it providing to this photosynthetic partner? Many think it's kind of protection against UV rays. And keeping them drier can kind of keep the moisture in, right? And that's what we find on the trees. We talked about that. But again, it's a partnership between the two. Very common ones. And a common, one that was just recently found is in salamander eggs. Some salamander eggs have a mutualistic relationship with algae. And what they found is that it provides the growing tadpole with some oxygen, some extra oxygen. The algae is going to be able to furnish that oxygen to these developing eggs. And the question is, well, what's the egg kind of gaining in benefit here? And many just think it could potentially be that they have kind of a more moderated habitat by being found within the egg sac or that gelatin mass. Marsh grass and mussels, another example of a mutualism. So remember we looked at zonation in the salt marsh, right? Some were high, some were low, some were submerged, some were higher ground. But we did talk about spartina, which is a local salt marsh grass. And it provides a lot of shade and structure for the mussels that would grow at the base of that. And so then you might wonder, well, what is the plant gaining from it? Well, it's gaining because it's an animal, right? The mussel is an animal, all the nitrogenous waste. So that extra nitrogen that the plants might need can get it from the mussels that are at the base of their roots. And it also helps to stabilize them. So in case there's kind of a flood event, they can persist. So a symbiosis in general is a tight relationship of two organisms. It can be on a range of the spectrum. It can be a plus minus like parasitism. It can be a plus plus like mutualism. It can be a -0 and a +0 like commensal and amensalism. Think about the types of parasites, ecto, endo, micro, macro. Think about how they can regulate populations, all the examples we gave, give an example of commensalism, what is it? Think about mutualisms, right? What are the types? Obligate, how do we classify them? Obligate or facultative? Can we give examples of those? Can we think of, the different types of partnerships, the cleaner examples, the pollinator examples, right? Come up with those examples when come test time or quiz time. All right, we don't have a ton of time to dig into the homework, but let me preface the lecture that I'm covering right now, just like with demography, is largely like, how do we do the math homework? Okay, so there's going to be slides that will give you an example of how to do this homework assignment. If you go to our community section, which is right below the community interactions that we were just covering. Plus, there's some good videos. If you guys were in that community interaction one, I found some really good example videos. So if you come down over here, community interactions, the ones that we just covered, competition, predation, other species interactions like symbiosis, it's all in there. The Jeopardy review game, if anyone wants to practice and prep for tests and stuff, is there. The lecture that I'm going to be covering today into Friday is right here, and the assignment is right here. It's a community diversity assignment. It's a couple of math problems, and the Dropbox for it is right here. We can assign it today. You guys can turn it in Monday. I would say we're going to get through most of it on Friday, Friday's lecture. So, feel free to not be rushed to try and do it today or anything. There will be another community assignment that comes from one of those interactives. But that I'm not going to assign until the next PowerPoint that we get to. So again, no rush on taking those, taking the lead on those at this point. All right, let me pull this up and get through a couple slides with you guys. When we talk about communities, we've moved on from populations. We're talking about organisms interacting with one another, plants and animals, different types of animals, how all of these in the rocky intertidal, in a forest, in a meadow, how they interact with one another. So we're going to define what a community is, which we sort of did. And we're going to think about how we measure them, just like with populations. How did we measure them? We did a survey, we did a transect, we did mark recapture, we did a quadrat survey, right? And so we'll think about how we can evaluate them. What kind of math can we do to see which community is more diverse? And we'll think about how the community structure. Do we have a lot of vertical structure like we saw in the tropical rainforest? That should mean we have a lot of diversity. There's a lot of niche availability. Do we have one overpowering, really strong competitor? That would be the dominant species. Or do we have a keystone species in there that eats that competitive dominant or knocks it back a little so that we can maximize diversity? And then how do we compare the diversity across different communities? That's the community similarity index, and we'll cover that. So defining a community, it's a group of different organisms, plants and animals. They all have to be living in the same place and time. Take a cookie cutter, plop it down over where you're located. That's your community. And so we can think about diversity by going and looking at one site. Like today, we may just go out to one spot in Gruber Woods, although I think I'm going to take you to two. So if we've just looked at a community in one location, that's alpha diversity. If we compared two or more, beta diversity we might be looking at. And you can see some look more similar than others. The measures that we'll do will be a few. Species richness is the easiest. Count the different species I see, not the numbers of all of them. Just, do I see white pine, red pine, birch? My species richness is 3. Okay, I don't care how many of each of them there are. Those were just the 3 unique species I found. That's the easiest, species richness. Relative abundance deals with the counts. Oh, I saw, 12 out of the 100 that were the birch tree, and I saw 6 out of the 100 that were the red pine, and I saw 85 that were the white pine, right? That's the relative abundance, the proportion, the piece of eye, the proportion out of the total that I surveyed that were represented by that one particular species. Now, evenness thinks about, was the proportion about the same across all those, members of species? Were they, 25%, 25%, 25% represented, or was there one super dominant like 80 and the others were all 10 and 5s, right? So a dominant versus a rare. And then we'll think about functional diversity, right? In my community, do I have several pollinators? Do I have several herbivore species that if I lost one due to a disease, could the other ones take over? That's what we mean by functional diversity. And then the structure, the physical structure, if we have more structure, more vertical structure, overstory, understory, canopy, then we'll probably have more species, more diversity, okay? So again, we talked about species richness being the easiest. How many species do we have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have that as well here, right? Here we have 2 of the same and 2 of the same. So that's 1, 2, 3 species. The most species rich community would be these 2 communities, right? And the homework is like this. It's like this slide right here, okay? You guys are gonna have a table with species listed. You'll go out and you'll count the number that you found of each of those species. You get a count and you sum it up and you get a total, okay? You can then take it and make it a proportion. 76 out of 256. It would be 0.297. You're going to keep it as a decimal. They just multiplied it by 100. 36 divided by the total, 256. 17 divided by 256. You guys are going to get your piece of eye or your relative abundance, the proportion of that N, the count you got of that species divided by the total of all the species you counted. That's your piece of eye or relative abundance. That's the 3rd column on your page for your homework, okay? And you'll notice this one has a lot of yellow poplar and not as many as the others. Really, these guys are very rare, okay? So the N of that species, the count of that species divided by your total, and that's the piece of eye for each of those, the relative abundance. Now here's another community. You could jump over to another forest stand. There's 122 yellow poplar out of 274 total. Right? You added everybody up, you got 274. Sassafras, 107 out of 274. Again, 0.445, 0.391. Those are your piece of eyes. They just multiplied it by 100 to get to a percentage, okay? So I'm going to jump over here because this is your homework, okay? Here's that piece of eye column. You get this from me. You get your names of your species, you get your N's, sum them up. That's your first step. Then do your proportion, the relative abundance. Take that number N that you counted of them, divide it by your total, and you get your proportion, your relative abundance, okay? The key is to check, do they all sum up to 1? If so, you're good. Now just hit your LN button for each one of those, okay? Now do like we did with demography, cross multiply, right? Take your piece of eye, multiply it by your LN piece of eye. That's what this column is, okay? So the final column is just take your LN piece of eye and your piece of eye, multiply them together, sum them up, and take the negative value of it. That's the diversity of your community. That will get you through parts 1 and 2 of the homework, okay? That H is your Shannon-Weiner diversity index. It runs from 0 to a value H max, okay? And the H max is calculated right here. It's the LN of your species richness. So if there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, my species richness is 5 species. I take the LN of that, I get this value, and then I compare my value here to that, and I can determine if I was really not diverse or very diverse, right? The higher I am towards H max, the more diverse, and vice versa, okay? And to calculate evenness, you take the ratio of the H that you just got here to the H max that you calculated, and that's your evenness. So that's how you would do questions 1 and 2 on that homework. I'm going to stop there because I don't want anybody to go over time, and I have to get up to you guys for lab. But that'll get you through part 1 and 2. We'll continue it on Friday. And for anybody who's traveling for the holiday, I'm going to do like usual, and I'll have it posted. So in case you're traveling and trying to avoid the snow and stuff, you can just watch the video. All right. So feel free to give it a shot if you want. All of the calculation is there. And then a few down, you'll have the calculation for the question 3 on the homework. So feel free if you wanted to, check it out. But I'm going to see my lab in front of Clinton at 1 o'clock. All right. I'll see you guys.